Okay, on to the main topic. Hi everybody, for those who don't know me, my name's Jonathan Clark. I work at Normation. I co-founded Normation back in 2010, so that's 7 years ago now. And every year we come to CfgMgmtCamp to talk about, well, Rudder and configuration management. And every year I basically give the same talk. It's not actually the same talk, it's the same title of the same talk. And I go through what's new in Rudder and what we're going to be doing in the future. But this year, actually, I had a really hard time fitting all of the amazing new things we've done into a single set of slides, which is very different from last year. So hopefully I'm not going to speak much longer than the 20 minutes I've been assigned, but we'll see. Basically, what I'm trying to cover today is what is new since last year and what we're going to be doing in the future. So I'm just going to be running through a few features, some news, some spoilers may have just appeared on the slide. Basically what's new is features, what's the future is plugins, also features, but just in nice little boxes. So the past and the present. One thing you may have noticed since last year is that we have a whole new logo. It looks slightly more modern, in my opinion, at least. I'm told that there's a whole new marketing dimension around the terms of continuous auditing and continuous configuration as well, which basically means configuring and auditing things all the time, regularly. In the same spirit of looking better, we hired in the team a full-time graphic designer, UI, UX expert. So this is his face, this is his competencies. Our website is full of amusing things like this about all of us, which are kind of close to the truth, but maybe not very precise. But you're probably more interested in seeing his work as opposed to his face. So this is what the interface in Rudder 4.0 now looks like. As you can see, we've moved to much more flat design, kind of sharper colors, and that is work that has appeared in Rudder 4.0, which was released back in late October, early November, and is going to continue throughout all releases coming up. So the first thing that happened is the interface was redesigned on the basic level, so the things that appear on every page, the menu, the shortcuts, the links, the pop-up shapes. And what's going to be happening in future releases is changing the way the pages work. So instead of having to, for example, click through groups and directives multiple layers at a time, open pop-ups to validate things, we're going to be trying to streamline that workflow a lot. Anyway, going back to the main topic of what we have been doing, this is a bit of a table of the main releases we've been working on. So we released Rudder 4.0 back in October. I'm going to go back into detail about what that was, and we're about to release Rudder 4.1 essentially next week or the following week. It's never been closer. As we say in French, it's constantly tomorrow. Currently, we have a two-version maintenance system. So we have ESR versions, which are extended support releases. The current one of those is 3.1. We maintain that up to 6 months after the next ESR version has been named. The next ESR version is very, very likely to be Rudder 4.1. So when that is named, probably at the end of this month, maybe the beginning of next month, we'll be encouraging everyone to upgrade to 4.1. So, what does Rudder 4.0 actually contain? There's the whole UI design, but I already showed you that. There's a whole load of new features that have appeared in the UI thanks to the fact that we now have a UI designer. For example, quick search. You can now just type anything into that little bar at the top that didn't used to be very useful. Now it will find absolutely anything you want with its rules, directives, groups, tags, parameters, any of these things, and display the exact results, and you can filter those. We've also added a file selector. You may remember that annoying technique where you can copy files, pretty basic pattern in config management. Well, now you can actually select the files instead of trying to remember the path in your memory. Another small change is that we can look through event logs by date. So for those who are not familiar with Rudder, every time you make a change in Rudder, like you change parameters in a directive, you create a new group or whatever, an event log is recorded. So you can always see all the changes that have happened in Rudder. And these event logs are stored. They happen to also be stored in a Git repository underneath. They're stored in a database. And this interface now allows you to query that with a very specific date and time parameter. So if you're looking for a change that occurred about a week ago, and since a week some of your servers aren't working as well, you can just enter that time frame here and see any events that match that time frame. So those are some UI niceties, shall we say. And the main new feature in Rudder 4.0 is what we call audit mode. So up until 4.0, the basic behavioral model of Rudder was to apply configurations. We've moved on from there in that any configurations we enter now can be either in audit mode or in enforce mode. Enforce mode is your traditional configuration management. I want the config to be like that. If the agent looks and the config is not correct, it'll change it, so it converges towards that. But a lot of our users actually have, well, important production systems. Who doesn't have important production systems, right? Large systems or systems where there are freezes. We work with banks, for example. In banks, they often have freezes during transaction periods. So one of the things that was requested was to be able to only audit configuration. So it sounded from our point of view a little bit like we were going backwards because we were doing less than before, but less is often more. And in this particular case, we can now only audit configurations, which actually changes the whole scope of what Rudder can do. So we can enter, for example, a whole security policy in, and we can just throw that at thousands of servers, and we'll get information back as to how compliant these servers are with no risk, because nothing has been changed. Just to clarify that nothing has been changed, the Rudder agent will write files on the system, but it'll only write its own files. It writes its own log files, it sends logs. Obviously, that's how we get the data back in the end, but it won't touch any of the target configurations. So that can be used node by node. We can say one node is audit only or enforce, or policy by policy. So my SSHD config, I just want to audit it, but not enforce it. This means that the general lifecycle in Rudder looks something like this. We define the desired state, probably via the web interface, maybe via the API, maybe through a git commit with a new technique or some NCF methods. That gets distributed to agents that come and get those policies from the central server, always pull, who will check state locally. Those of you who use Rudder know that we have a load of methods, NCF methods, that will vary the way we check things depending on each OS. And then either that's okay, we send a log back saying that's okay, either it's not okay, and then either we remediate if we're configuring, enforcing configuration, or we just send a message back saying it's not okay if we're auditing. Very simple. Slight change in the UI. You can see on the left here, there's some little colored blocks. Green for enforce, blue for audit, and the mixed ones are when several different machines under that same rule, some of them in audit, some of them enforce. So you can see that everywhere in the interface now. You can see what is audit, what is enforce. Some more UI niceties. We have added a tag interface to directives and rules, so we can add tags. Tags in our world are key equals value pairs, so something like environment equals production, customer equals large company name here. And you can use those to filter through all of your configs and just display those ones. And you can add tags to the UI at any time. This is the beginning of a lot more changes in Rudder. Our goal is to have tags on everything. We already have node properties that look a lot like tags. And at some point in the future, we're going to be able to use those tags to control access control on different items. So we could say, for example, Alexi over here can only access any configurations that have the tag customer equals his company. Or we could say that the new guy can only access any rules that do not have the tag environment equals production. And we can make any kind of combination of tags and control access like that. We can't yet, but we will be able to in the future. We've been moving a lot towards manipulating data, so much so that we actually have a whole talk on it later in the afternoon. And this is just a small preview. So you can basically put JSON data anywhere you used to be able to put strings. So the node property can now contain JSON data. You can expand the JSON data as JSON just by calling it. That's my first example here. Or you can dig down into that JSON using the same syntax we've always been using so you can dig down each level. You can add default values if you don't know if that data is going to be defined for a given node. Say I want node properties, and if there's not a value present, I'll use a default. You can have defaults for defaults. The example didn't fit on the slide, so I didn't include one, but you can have a default value that is a variable that has another default value, and so on. I'm just going to pause while everyone takes a photo of that slide. And lower down in the NCF level, where we have our NCF building blocks, we can also import JSON with a simple NCF method there. And then those JSON variables imported just become standard variables that can be used anywhere. They can be used in templates, they can be used in directives, they can be used to report information, anything we want. So, by the way, feel free to interrupt me at any time if you have questions. I'm just skimming over these features because there are lots of little features, but I tend to talk a lot. It's kind of my job, it's kind of why I'm here. But if you do have questions, just jump in at any time. Okay, so the next new feature that we've recently introduced is an API on relay servers. So a quick reminder, what is a relay server? Rudder has a central server that's pictured right here at the top, and you can have nodes that connect directly to that central server. That would be your basic setup. But out there in the real world with production servers and large corporations, there often tend to be several distinct network areas. Are they distinct because of administrative reasons, like a DMZ, or are they distinct geographically, such as I have a data center in London, one in Paris, one in Berlin, some in the US, some in China, etc.? It doesn't matter. The answer for that is usually to have each of those data centers be independent. And the way we achieve that in Rudder is using relay servers. So a relay server could be seen as a proxy. It's not a connected proxy, unlike a web proxy. It's a disconnected proxy in that all nodes in an isolated network zone connect to the local relay server. They can completely be autonomous with no limit in time. They can stay there for years if necessary. And that relay server will bring information back up to the central server and back down at any point. So these relay servers now have an API, a REST API, that is dedicated to them. This enables us to pass information through the exact same path all the way down to nodes and up from nodes, whereas before we had to kind of skip through those firewall walls, which obviously didn't work in many cases. So the simplest example is when you want to trigger an immediate run on a node. We used to have to do that with direct connectivity from my desktop, if I was running it from there, to the node. Now we can pass that information through the relay servers so that, once again, you only have one firewall wall open between your main server and your relay server, which is what actually happens in real life, right? The second scenario is slightly more interesting in that now nodes can share files between themselves. A simple example of this would be setting up a slave or a copy or maybe even a second master of a database. If you have a first server that actually has the database and you want to make a dump of that database, send it across to the second node, you can do that with this relay API that will send the file on the minimum length circuit it can. So if you're sending it to a node sitting right next to it in the data center, it won't have to go up through all of the servers. It will just go to its local relay server and come back down. But if you do want to send it to a node in another data center across the world, it will sort that out and go through the firewalls and the relay servers and the central server until it gets back down to the right place. When you do this, there's a couple of NCF methods that you can use to share a file, to get a file. We have paid attention that you share a file from node A to node B. No other nodes can read it. There's a time to live. So if that database dump is gigabytes large and you say I only want it to live for 1 day because in 2 days it's not useful, it will get deleted after 1 day. So we're not wasting space for too long anyway. And there's a signature system involved to make sure that only the node that it's destined for can actually get that information back. Hey, come in. So, a couple of other new things. We've always had package management methods in Rudder, obviously, but they used to be divided into two worlds. There was the RPM world and there was the Debian world, and package upgrades were notoriously difficult. So we've replaced that by one single implementation. It's an NCF method called package state. It currently works on APT systems, Debian, Ubuntu, etc., RPM systems such as SUSE, CentOS, etc. It uses Zipper as well on SUSE, and it can work on BSD. So you can provide a very simple package state declaration, or use the interfaces that are slightly simpler, package present, package absent, to just make sure a package is there. It will handle upgrades nicely. It will remove packages nicely. It does everything you'd expect, basically. And that has, in turn, caused a new technique in the Rudder interface to be introduced, which replaces the previous techniques, which were separate. So we recommend everyone to be changing and moving towards the simple package management technique now. Another small but interesting change, at least I hope it's interesting, is Ginger templating. So as well as the Mustache language, you can use Ginger. It requires installing a Python package on the system. Most Linux systems already have that, but it's very simple to add it using NCF itself, obviously. And the Ginger language is slightly more advanced. You can do slightly more things than you can in Mustache, so that's pretty nice. Last but not least, we've introduced a plugin. So this is one of the first new feature plugins for Rudder called data sources. So I was saying earlier about node properties, which are key value pairs on nodes. You'd use them to bring in IT knowledge on a machine, such as this machine belongs to this customer, or this machine is being rented out with the following SLA, or it's in a production environment, these kind of things. Often that data resides in another application already. It doesn't belong in Rudder, it's not managed in Rudder. You'd have it in a CMDB or a system management software somewhere. So we can use this new feature to go and query on a REST API any data that will be returned either as a simple value or as a JSON structure, and store it for each node. There are two ways of doing that, node by node. So if you've got 1,000 nodes, that means 1,000 HTTP calls. Or you can just do one call where you get all the data, and then we can pass through it and assign that data out. That all feeds in to the JSON structures we were talking about earlier. Easy to access, available everywhere. So, quick recap. What is new in Rudder 4.0, 4.1? I've been through a few things. The main big thing that is changing the way we look at Rudder is audit mode. The ability to just check configs, get very detailed statistics and metrics about them. Redesign UI, quick search, search event logs by date, tags, and those are the beginning, like I said, of a more advanced access control system, node properties, so on and so on. But, and this is probably what we were really here to talk about, the future. What does the future hold for Rudder? Well, I'm going to keep the suspense going, and just before I get there, I'm going to take a small path aside and talk about open source business models. It happens to be a subject that's dear to my heart, and it also explains what we're about to do. So when you set up a company to make open source software, a company usually needs to make money to survive because they have employees and they have to pay for offices and so on. At Normation, we're kind of in the same situation. We need money to survive, right? So when we started Rudder, we were like, how are we going to make money from open source software? You don't get money by giving away software, right? And there's several models that exist out there. The most simple is selling services. Hey, I know about the software, you need my advice, I'll come and do some days of consulting for you. Well, that's great, but it does tend to encourage software developers to make it harder to use their software, because then they sell more consulting. I'm not saying everyone does that, but it's the kind of thing that we'd like to avoid.
Do you have actual evidence of that, or is it just conjecture? I never heard an engineer do that for us, but I mean, it happens, so it's not really, you don't like an actual case.
Yeah, so I'm just going to repeat the question for the recording. The question was, do I actually have evidence of what I'm saying, or is that just my conjecture? Is that right?
Well,
yeah, no, that's fine.
Do people actually change their software hardware?
I have seen that happen. I've seen people remove documentation from being open source to make it closed source, to sell the documentation or to sell the expertise, yeah. I'm not saying it's common, but it's something that happens. The second model is having a two-speed system with a community version and an enterprise version or a pro version. That is something that I have taken public stances against many times, because I really believe that the two-speed system encourages you to have a good version and a bad version. Let's say you have an urgent security fix. Do you fix it in the community version that's used by millions of users first, or do you fix it in the paid version that you get money from first? Impossible decision. Interestingly, Chef used to run like that, but they've changed now to avoid the dual system because they felt that exact same way. They wrote that in a blog post. Another option is to have open source code but sell the binaries and support. That's exactly what Red Hat does. So Red Hat is an open source operating system. You can download the source, you can build it, but if you want to get a binary of it, you have to pay them for it. And the fourth system is an open source platform where plugins come and add features, value. A great example of that is WordPress, I think. You can do a lot of things with WordPress. There's a lot of open source plugins out there, but if you really want a complex theme or an advanced plugin, some people will go and sell those. So that is the model that we chose with Rudder years ago, although up until now we haven't had that many plugins. But we do intend now to start developing many more plugins, partly because we like this business model. I'm not saying they're all going to be closed source, not at all. In fact, we're quite against having closed source plugins. But having plugins that you can add in or not have makes it a lot easier to add in features and not bloat the main Rudder with features that people don't need. I was just talking about data sources to run HTTP requests over REST APIs for each node. If you don't need that, you don't need the code lying around on your server. So anyway, plugins. And I'm happy to discuss the whole open source stuff over a beer at any time. We already have a few plugins. There's Windows support and AIX support that are plugins for Rudder. So you can use Rudder in its basic version. Works fine on Linux, on BSD. I've heard people using it on macOS as well. If you want to run it on Windows, that is actually a closed source plugin that we sell at Normation. And AIX is kind of more on the Red Hat model. It's an open source plugin, but you can build it yourself, or we sell pre-built versions. We have an advanced reporting plugin that generates PDF reports to see what policy compliance was over the past week, month, 3 months, year, whatever you want. And we have a little plugin that just adds in data from local pages into the web interface. We now have node properties data sources. It's a beta version. And there are a couple of third-party plugins. They're not actually plugins for Rudder. They're plugins for other applications that use Rudder. All of them do the same thing. So Rudder has built-in inventory capabilities. And the plugins will go and get that inventory from Rudder's API and make it available to those applications. So if you're using Ansible, before it can connect out an SSH into every box in the system, it needs to know what those boxes are. And Rudder provides that. Well, the plugin for Ansible for Rudder provides that. Same for Rundeck, same for iTop, which is an open source CMDB, for those who don't know it. And the future. Here we are. These are the ideas that we are either already starting work on, or that we're planning on, or that we're thinking about doing in the future. That was a very non-committal way of saying these things may or may not happen. The ones near the top are going to happen. The ones near the bottom are probably going to happen. So our main 2 tasks for 2017 are going to be writing a new agent to support Windows using Microsoft's DSC technology. For those who aren't familiar with DSC, it's short for Desired State Configuration. It is part of PowerShell 4 and 5, so it's integrated with Windows 2012, Server 2012 and later, and you can install it on a couple of versions. It is now open source because Microsoft open sourced PowerShell, and it's actually built on promise theory. So the theory that Mark Burgess wrote and implemented in CfgMgmtCamp that Puppet and others have built upon. The guy that wrote this at Microsoft went to see Mark Burgess and said, hey, how do you do this config management stuff? I'm very interested, I read your theory, and obviously Mark spent some time with him, and he has implemented it in that exact same spirit as Mark's promise theory has. In fact, the syntax looks surprisingly like CfgMgmtCamp if you really look into it, which is a bit odd, but it works great, and we're going to be building an agent on that to better support Windows systems. And the second main task of 2017 is going to be advanced access control, so using the tag system, like I mentioned earlier. Other plugins that we're going to be bringing in throughout 2017, maybe 2018. One is very simple, just be able to customize the web interface, add your own logo in there, maybe add a little text saying this is the development server, this is the production server, things like that. Some people in this room have been requesting it repeatedly. High availability for the Rudder server. You can already do this, but it's quite a manual process. So we'd like to build in to Rudder itself mechanisms to copy data and ensure the data is copied over, so you can always have your two servers running. Ramp up system. This is something we get requested often and that we'd really like to do. If you're running configuration management over thousands of nodes and you want to change a policy, it is good practice, or at least it's sound-minded, not to roll it out over all of thousands of nodes at once, but instead to test it on maybe 1, and then 10, and then 100, or and then 500. There's obviously different scenarios you could do that in. Start with development servers, start with the oldest servers, start with the newest servers, whatever. That's something that we see more happening after 2017, so probably next year. Next year. Syncing data between Rudder servers. Common scenario is that we'll have environments that are very locked down with a dev environment, a production environment, a backup environment, where there is actually no network connectivity between the environments for security reasons, in which case it could be good to be able to sync Rudder servers independently. And high availability for relays, same thing as for the main server, but for relay servers. So those are the main ideas. There'll probably be other things as well. Like I said, the UI will continue to evolve throughout the next versions. A couple of extra tools that are available or pretty much available. The first one is we have created a knowledge base, online knowledge base. It's available now on faq.rudderproject.org. It is basically where we're going to be trying to put more and more troubleshooting guides, frequently asked questions, those questions that come up on IRC channels, and we answer them every few weeks. Instead of repeating the question in an inadequate and incomplete manner on IRC, we're now doing our best to always put them in the knowledge base and then send a link to the knowledge base so that that information gets built upon. And secondly, Alexi here has started a Rudder development blog, which every 2 weeks roughly has a blog post saying what we're working on, what we're doing. Back in October, we had a meeting to discuss what went well in our last development cycle, what went less well. And we felt that we were doing a lot of work that people who saw the work were pleased with and liked and encouraged us in, but that we weren't telling people about the work. So there'd be this flush when we released a version, and people were like, oh, wow, this is cool. And then 6 months of silence until we released a version, and flush. Oh, that's cool. So we're trying to level that out by sharing that to people who are interested. And hopefully sharing more data about that will actually make it easier to join in with the development effort as well, and say like, oh, hey, you're working on package systems at the moment. Well, it just so happens that I really care about that. Let me help you, for example. So that was basically it. I probably went way over time. I'm sorry about that. Do we have any questions? Yeah, it's shipped by default as of PowerShell 4, which is shipped by default as of Microsoft Windows Server 2012 R2. And 2016 has it by default. And you can install it on 2012. We have to upgrade PowerShell. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're actually working in partnership with Microsoft France to do that development. So they're very keen for Rudder to work on Microsoft. So they're like helping us out, technically speaking, for that to happen. Which is nice.
Really from Microsoft?
Sorry?
Is that really Microsoft?
Yep.
That's insane.
Yeah.
Nice.
They have marketing that says Microsoft has changed,
Yeah,
but it seems like it's true.
Oh, okay.
Any more questions? New features, old features, future features, plugins, open source? Nope. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry, I was rolling.
Don't worry.